Sometimes the kindness of a stranger can save more than just your life. It can restore your faith in humanity itself. On a bitter winter night in 1878, a starving young woman made a choice that would change everything. Sarah Bennett hadn't eaten in 3 days when she slipped behind the general store, reaching for a loaf of bread with trembling hands. A massive mountain man caught her red-handed. But instead of turning her in, Jack McAllister made her an unexpected offer. He would give her food, shelter, and protection. There was just one condition: she had to become his wife. What would make a desperate woman agree to marry a complete stranger, and why would a solitary mountain man offer such a vow? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 weeks before Sarah Bennett's trembling fingers reached for that loaf of bread, Jack McAllister sat alone in his mountain cabin, watching the first heavy snowfall of the season blanket the world outside his window. At 42 years old, he'd spent the last 15 years in these mountains, choosing solitude over the complications of civilization. Most men would have gone mad with such isolation, but Jack had his reasons for staying away from people. The cabin he'd built with his own hands stood sturdy against the wind, logs chinked tight with moss and mud, a stone fireplace that could heat the single room even in the deepest winter. It wasn't much by town standards, just one main room with a sleeping loft above and a small storeroom for his furs and supplies, but it was his, built on land that had belonged to an uncle he'd barely known. When he'd arrived here after the war, after the funeral, after everything fell apart, the place had been abandoned. He'd simply stayed, and no one had ever challenged his claim. Jack rose from his chair and poured himself another cup of coffee from the pot that sat perpetually warm on the edge of the fireplace. His journal lay open on the rough-hewn table, filled with sketches of the mountains, the animals he trapped, the changing seasons. He'd never been much for words, but drawing helped pass the long evenings, helped keep his mind from wandering back to places it shouldn't go. Outside, the wind howled through the pines. He'd need to check his trap lines tomorrow before the snow got too deep. The pelts had been good this year: beaver, mink, a few fox. In another week, he'd make the trip down to Silver Ridge to trade them with Samuel at the general store. Samuel was one of the few people Jack could tolerate, a quiet man who understood that not everyone wanted to fill silence with meaningless chatter. Jack ran his hand over his bearded face and moved to the window. From here, he could see for miles when the weather was clear, nothing but mountains and forest, exactly as he preferred it. No neighbors to worry about, no one to disappoint, no one to lose. But lately, something had been shifting inside him. The satisfaction he'd once found in his solitary routine had begun to feel hollow. He was getting older, and these winters seemed harder each year. Not that he couldn't handle the work, he was still strong, still capable. It was something else, something he didn't like to name. Loneliness had a way of creeping up on a man, slow and patient as a winter frost. He thought about his monthly trips to town, how he'd started paying more attention to the people there. Silver Ridge was barely more than a handful of buildings clinging to existence in the Montana Territory: a general store, a saloon, a boarding house, a doctor's office that doubled as just about everything else the town needed. Most of the prospectors who'd come through during the gold rush years had moved on, leaving behind only those stubborn or desperate enough to make a life in this unforgiving place. Doc Harrington was another decent man, educated back east, but drawn west by some adventure he never talked about. He served as the town's doctor, its justice of the peace, and its voice of reason when disputes arose. Jack respected him for his quiet competence and lack of judgment. Last month, during his supply run, Jack had noticed things getting harder in town. The early winter had come fierce and unexpected, catching people unprepared. He'd seen more thin faces, more desperate eyes. There'd been a group of travelers passing through, looking for work that didn't exist. Among them, He'd noticed a young woman, couldn't have been more than 22 or 23, with auburn hair and a face that still held traces of better days. She'd been standing outside the boarding house, her coat too thin for the weather, her eyes scanning the street with the careful wariness of someone who'd learned the world wasn't safe. He'd thought about her a few times since then, wondered if she'd found work or moved on. Probably moved on. Smart people didn't stay in Silver Ridge unless they had no choice. Jack closed the journal and placed it back on the shelf he'd built into the wall. Beside it sat a few other books, a Bible his mother had given him, a volume of poetry he'd never admit to reading, a practical guide to wilderness survival he'd long since memorized. On the highest shelf, wrapped carefully in oilcloth, was a small wooden box. He never opened it anymore, but he couldn't bring himself to get rid of it either. The fire crackled, sending shadows dancing across the walls. He added another log and settled back into his chair, his thoughts drifting, as they often did on these long winter nights. He thought about the life he'd left behind the farm in Ohio, his young wife Elizabeth with her bright laugh and gentle hands, the baby they'd been expecting. He thought about coming home from a neighbor's barn, raising to find Doc Henderson's wagon outside, the look on the old doctor's face when he'd opened the door. Childbed fever, they'd called it. Both gone within hours of each other, mother and son, before Jack had even gotten to meet his boy. He'd tried to stay, to keep the farm going, but everywhere he looked he saw ghosts. The cradle he'd built sat empty in the corner. Elizabeth's dresses still hung in the wardrobe. After 6 months of that torture, he'd sold everything and headed west, looking for a place remote enough that he could forget. Turned out you couldn't really forget. You could only get far enough away that the memories didn't ambush you quite so often. 15 years was a long time to spend running from the past. Lately, he'd begun to wonder if maybe he'd run far enough. The wind rattled the shutters, pulling him back to the present. He should get some sleep. Tomorrow would be a long day on the trap lines, and he needed to start preparing for his trip to Silver Ridge. He'd need supplies to get through the worst of winter: flour, coffee, sugar, maybe some tobacco if Samuel had any decent stock. And he needed to trade those furs while they were still prime. Jack climbed the ladder to the sleeping loft, his body moving with the easy strength of a man who'd spent his life doing physical labor. He stretched out on the bed he'd built, covered himself with the heavy quilts and furs that kept the mountain cold at bay, and stared up at the dark ceiling. Sleep came slowly, as it usually did, and when it finally arrived, he dreamed of things he'd thought he'd learned: to stop wanting a warm voice in the morning, someone to share the coffee with, hands that weren't his own, helping with the work. He dreamed of a cabin that felt like a home instead of just a shelter. He woke before dawn, as he always did, and pushed the dreams away. Dreams were dangerous things for a man who'd learned that wanting something was the surest way to lose it. But 3 weeks later, when he'd catch a thin young woman stealing bread in the middle of a freezing night, those dreams would come rushing back with a force that surprised even him. And in that moment, watching her terrified eyes meet his in the darkness behind Samuel's store, Jack McAllister would make a decision that would change both their lives forever. For now, though, he simply dressed, made his coffee, and headed out into the snow to check his traps, unaware that fate was already setting the pieces in motion. Sarah Bennett pressed herself against the rough wooden wall of the general store, her breath coming in shallow clouds of white vapor. The night was brutally cold, the kind of cold that seeped through worn fabric and settled into bones. She hadn't eaten in 3 days, and the gnawing emptiness in her stomach had long since turned from pain to a hollow, dizzy weakness. 3 months ago she'd had a future. Not a grand one, but a future nonetheless. Her parents had owned a small farm in Pennsylvania, nothing fancy but enough to get by. Her father had been a good man, steady and kind. Her mother had taught her to read, to sew, to appreciate the small beauties in life: a sunset, a well-prepared meal, the sound of rain on the roof. They'd been a family, small, but complete. Then the fever came. First her father. his strength failing over the course of 2 terrible weeks. Then her mother, who'd worn herself out nursing him, following him into death just 5 days later. Sarah had been 19 years old, suddenly alone with debts she couldn't pay and land she couldn't work by herself. The Hendersons, a family heading west with promises of opportunity in the Montana Territory, had seemed like a godsend. They'd needed help with their children during the journey, and they'd promised Sarah work at their new ranch once they arrived. She'd sold everything, the farm, the furniture, her mother's good dishes, and used the money to pay her parents' debts and buy passage west. The journey had been hard, months of travel in cramped wagons, crossing rivers and mountains, watching the landscape grow wilder and more beautiful and more terrifying with each passing mile. But Sarah had been young enough to still have hope, to believe that hardship was temporary and that better days waited just over the horizon. They'd arrived in Silver Ridge 6 weeks ago, and that's when everything fell apart. There was no ranch. Mr. Henderson had gambled away most of his money in saloons along the trail, and what remained wasn't enough to buy the property he'd promised his family. Mrs. Henderson had looked at Sarah with tired, guilty eyes and said there was no work, no money to pay her, nothing they could do. They'd given her $3 and directions to the boarding house, then disappeared into the growing darkness of their own failure. $3 lasted exactly 1 week in a frontier town where everything was expensive and jobs for single women were non-existent. The boarding house owner had been kind but firm. No money meant no room. Sarah had tried everywhere. The saloon owner had looked her up and down with eyes that made her skin crawl and offered her work she absolutely would not do. The doctor had been sympathetic but had no need for help. The few families in town either couldn't afford hired help or wouldn't trust a stranger. She'd spent the last 2 weeks sleeping in an abandoned lean-to behind the livery stable, wrapped in every piece of clothing she owned. She'd sold her good boots, her mother's shawl, everything except the tattered coat on her back and the small cameo brooch pinned inside it, the last thing her mother had given her. She couldn't bring herself to part with that, even though she knew it might buy her a few more days of survival. Now, standing in the freezing darkness behind Samuel's general store, Sarah felt the last threads of her dignity unraveling. She'd never stolen anything in her life. Her parents had raised her to be honest, to work hard, to earn what she had. But hunger had a way of eroding principles, and the smell of fresh bread from Samuel's store had been calling to her for hours. She'd watched him close up at sunset, seen him walk away toward his home above the saloon. The back door to the store was locked, but there was a window that didn't quite close properly. She'd noticed it 3 days ago during her desperate wandering. It had taken her this long to work up the courage, or maybe the desperation, to actually go through with it. Her hands were shaking, from cold or fear or weakness she couldn't tell. She pushed at the window, and it gave way with a soft creak that sounded thunderous in the quiet night. Sarah glanced around, saw no one, and pulled herself up and through, landing clumsily on the floor inside. The store smelled like coffee and tobacco and dried goods, and underneath it all, the heavenly scent of bread. Samuel baked fresh loaves 3 times a week, and today had been baking day. Sarah's eyes adjusted to the darkness, and she could make out the shapes of barrels and shelves, and there on the counter a cloth-covered basket. She moved toward it on unsteady legs, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. Just 1 loaf, just enough to quiet the terrible emptiness, to give her strength to figure out what to do next. She'd find a way to pay Samuel back someday, she promised herself. Someday, when her life wasn't falling apart. Her fingers touched the cloth covering the basket, pulled it back. There were 4 loaves, golden and perfect. She reached for the smallest one, lifted it with both hands like it was something precious. It was still slightly warm. "When did you last eat?" Sarah's whole body went rigid. The voice came from behind her, deep and quiet and completely calm. She turned slowly, the bread clutched against her chest, and saw a massive shape in the doorway, a man so tall he had to duck slightly to stand in the frame. shoulders broad enough to block most of the light from the street. Terror flooded through her. She'd be arrested, thrown in jail, or worse. Her mind spun with images of everything that could happen to a woman caught stealing in a frontier town where law was often handled by whoever was strongest or angriest. "I asked you a question." The man stepped forward, and she could see him better now. He had a thick, dark beard streaked with grey, intense eyes that studied her with an expression she couldn't quite read. He wore heavy furs and carried himself with the solid presence of someone who spent his life doing hard physical work. "When did you last eat? When did you last eat?" 3 days, Sarah whispered, then hated herself for answering. What did it matter? Desperation wasn't an excuse for theft. The man looked at her for a long moment, taking in her thin frame, her worn clothes, the way she swayed slightly on her feet. Then he reached past her, took the cloth from the basket, and wrapped it around the loaf she was holding. "Come on," he said simply. "What?" Sarah's voice came out as barely more than a breath. "I said, come on. You're going to eat." He moved toward the door, clearly expecting her to follow. "You're not taking me to the sheriff?" He paused and looked back at her, something almost like surprise crossing his features. "I'm taking you to the diner. Can't have a conversation with someone who's about to fall over from hunger." Sarah's legs felt like they might give out entirely. "I don't understand." "Leven you nethers. Nothing to understand right now. We'll talk after you eat. But we're leaving through the front door, not crawling back out that window. And I'm locking up proper behind us." His tone was matter-of-fact, neither cruel nor particularly kind, just stating how things would be. She followed him because she couldn't think of what else to do, her mind unable to process what was happening. He locked the store behind them, pocketed the key, apparently he had permission to do that, and began walking down the empty street toward the small building that served as Silver Ridge's diner. The diner owner, a weathered woman named Martha, looked up in surprise when they entered. "Jack McAllister. Didn't expect to see you in town for another week. Came down early. Need a favor, Martha? Fix a proper meal for the lady here. Whatever she wants, much as she can eat. Put it on my account." Martha's eyes moved between Jack and Sarah, taking in Sarah's desperate appearance and Jack's calm demeanor. She was clearly curious, but knew better than to ask questions. "Take that table by the stove where it's warmest. I'll bring coffee while you decide what you want." Sarah sank into the chair. Jack pulled out for her, and the warmth from the stove nearby felt like a physical embrace. Jack sat across from her, pushed the wrapped bread toward her. "Go ahead. I know you're hungry." She tore into the bread with shaking hands, trying to maintain some dignity but too starved to care much about appearances. It was the most delicious thing she'd ever tasted, or maybe hunger just made it seem that way. She forced herself to eat slowly, knowing from experience that eating too fast after days of emptiness would make her sick. Martha brought coffee, strong and hot, and Sarah wrapped her hands around the mug, absorbing its warmth. Jack ordered for both of them beef stew, cornbread, apple pie. When it came, Sarah ate methodically, concentrating on each bite, barely aware of the handful of other patrons in the diner watching with open curiosity. Finally, when the worst of her hunger had been quieted, she looked up at the man across from her. He'd eaten his own meal in silence, seemingly content to wait until she was ready to talk. "Why?" she asked simply. Jack took a sip of his coffee, considering his answer. "I've seen enough desperation to recognize it. And I've been hungry enough myself to know what it does to a person." He paused, his eyes meeting hers with surprising directness. "What's your name?" "Sarah. Sarah Bennett. I'm Jack McAllister. Most people call me Bear on account of my size and temperament." There was the slightest hint of dry humor in his voice. "You got any family in Silver Ridge?" "No family anywhere." The words came out flat, emotionless. She'd cried all her tears weeks ago. "No prospects for work?" "I've tried everywhere." "There's nothing." Jack nodded slowly. as if she'd confirmed something he already suspected. He was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah watched emotions play across his weathered face: consideration, doubt, resolve. "I'm going to say something, and I want you to hear me all the way through before you answer." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping lower. "I live up in the mountains, about 3 hours from here. Built a cabin on land that's been mine for 15 years. It's a hard life, but it's a good one. I provide for myself, just fine, hunt, trap, trade furs. I've got everything I need except—" He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "Except company, someone to share the work and the life. I'm not a young man anymore, and these winters get harder every year." Sarah's heart began to beat faster, though she wasn't sure if it was from hope or fear. "I'm offering you a choice," Jack continued. "You can walk out that door right now with enough money to get yourself somewhere else, somewhere bigger with more opportunities. Or," he took a breath, "or you can marry me, legal and proper. I'll give you a home, food, protection. You'll never have to steal bread again. In return, you keep the cabin, help with the work. It'll be a partnership, nothing more unless you decide otherwise. You'll have your own space, your own say in how things go. I'm not looking for—" He seemed uncomfortable now. "I'm not expecting romance or anything like that, just honest work and honest company." Sarah stared at him, trying to process what she was hearing. Marriage. To a complete stranger, a mountain man she'd met 10 minutes ago while stealing bread. "Why would you do this?" she whispered. "You don't know anything about me. I know you'd rather steal than sell yourself. I know you're desperate but not broken, and I know that sometimes two people who are alone are better off being alone together." He met her eyes steadily. "I'm not asking for an answer tonight, but I'm heading back up the mountain tomorrow afternoon. If you decide yes, meet me at Samuel's store at noon." He stood, placed money on the table for their meals, and turned to leave. At the door he paused and looked back. "There's no shame in whatever you decide, Miss Bennet, but if you do say yes, I'll keep my word to you. You'll be safe, fed, and treated with respect. You have my promise on that." Then he was gone, disappearing into the night, leaving Sarah sitting in the warmth of the diner with the taste of food in her mouth and an impossible decision weighing on her heart. She sat there long after her coffee went cold, staring at nothing, while her whole future hung suspended between desperation and hope. 6 weeks into their marriage, the worst blizzard of the season arrived with a vengeance. Sarah woke to find the windows completely obscured by snow, and when Jack tried to open the door, he had to push against a drift that had piled nearly 3 feet high against the entrance. "We're staying put for a few days," he announced, forcing the door closed against the howling wind. "No point trying to check traps in this. Can't see 10 feet in front of you out there." Being confined to the cabin together was different from their usual routine. There was nowhere to go, nothing to do but maintain the fire, prepare meals, and find ways to pass the time. The first day, they mostly read Sarah with her poetry book, Jack with a worn copy of a wilderness survival guide he'd long since memorized. By the second day, the silence felt different. Not uncomfortable exactly, but charged with a kind of restless energy. They were becoming too aware of each other in the small space, the way Sarah hummed softly while cooking, the way Jack's voice rumbled when he read aloud from his book, the careful dance they did to avoid too much accidental touching in the confined quarters. That afternoon, Sarah noticed Jack looking at his journal, the worn leather book he kept on the shelf. She'd seen it before but had never asked about it, respecting his privacy. Now, trapped together with nothing but time, curiosity got the better of her. "What do you write in there?" she asked. "Or is it private?" Jack glanced up, surprised by the question. He considered for a moment, then said, "Mostly I draw. Not much of a writer, but I can sketch things well enough." He paused. "You want to see?" "Only if you're comfortable sharing." He retrieved the journal and handed it to her, then returned to his chair, pretending to read but clearly watching her reaction from the corner of his eye. Sarah opened the journal carefully. The pages were filled with detailed sketches, mountains rendered in careful pencil strokes, animals caught in moments of natural grace, trees bent by wind, the cabin from various angles. The drawings were good, really good, showing an eye for detail and a patience that matched what she'd learned of Jack's character. Deeper into the journal, she found sketches of people. An older couple, stern-faced but kind-eyed, his parents perhaps. And then a drawing of a young woman with soft features and gentle eyes, her hand resting on a swollen belly. Sarah's breath caught. "That's Elizabeth," Jack said quietly. "Drew that about a week before I lost them." Sarah studied the drawing, seeing the love in every careful line. She was beautiful. She was. Jack was quiet for a moment. "I don't look at that page much anymore. Used to be I couldn't bear to, but I kept it because forgetting seemed worse than remembering." Sarah turned more pages, finding later sketches, all landscapes and animals, no more people, until near the end, where she found something that made her pause. It was a small, simple drawing of a wildflower, pressed flat between the pages, its delicate petals still holding faint color despite years of being stored away. "Found that the first spring after I came here," Jack said, his voice taking on a reflective quality. "Everything that year felt dead, including me. But that flower pushed up through the snow, bright and alive, and I thought—" He stopped, searching for words. "I thought maybe if something that small could survive, maybe I could too." Sarah felt tears prickling her eyes. She understood that impulse, the need to find meaning in small signs of perseverance. "May I tell you something I haven't told anyone?" "Of course." She reached inside her collar and pulled out the cameo brooch she'd kept hidden. "This was my mother's. It's the only thing I have left from my old life. I've kept it secret because I was afraid, if anyone knew I had it, they'd try to take it, or convince me to sell it." She held it out for him to see, a delicate profile of a woman carved in ivory against a blue background. "Sometimes I hold it and pretend I can still feel her presence, like she's still looking out for me somehow." Jack looked at the brooch, then at Sarah, his expression softening. "She'd be proud of you. The way you've handled everything, the strength you've shown, any mother would be proud of that." The simple words of affirmation broke something open in Sarah. She'd been holding herself together so carefully, being strong because she had to be, but hearing someone acknowledge the difficulty of what she'd endured made her realize just how much she'd been carrying. Tears spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them. "I'm sorry. I don't mean to. Nothing to apologize for." Jack stood and moved to sit beside her on the bench. He didn't touch her, but his presence was solid and comforting. They sat like that for a while, the storm raging outside while Sarah cried quietly for her lost parents, her lost life, and the fear she'd been holding at bay for months. Jack simply stayed beside her, a steady presence that asked for nothing but offered everything. When her tears finally subsided, she wiped her eyes with her sleeve and gave him a watery smile. "Thank you. For understanding. For all of it." "Sarah," Jack said, his voice serious, "I need you to know something. When I offered you marriage, it was partly practical. I won't lie about that. But it was also because, when I saw you that night, desperate but still fighting, still holding on to your dignity, even in the worst moment, I saw strength, real strength. The kind that comes from surviving things that should have broken you." He paused. "These weeks with you they've reminded me what it feels like to care about someone's well-being, to want to see them smile, to look forward to evening conversations. I want you to know that this arrangement, whatever it started as, it's become more than that for me." Sarah's heart was beating faster. "What has it become?" Jack met her eyes directly. "I don't know exactly what to call it yet, but I know that you're not just someone I'm helping anymore. You're—" he seemed to struggle with the words. "You're someone I care about. Someone whose happiness matters to me. Sarah reached out and took his hand, rough, calloused, but warm and solid. "I care about you too, more than I expected to, more than maybe either of us planned." Jack looked down at their joined hands, then gently squeezed hers. "We don't have to rush to name what this is, but I wanted you to know that whatever it becomes, I'm here. Not out of obligation, but because I choose to be." "I choose to be here too," Sarah said softly. They sat together in the warm cabin while the storm raged outside, hands clasped, the journal open between them showing all the careful documentation of Jack's lonely years. But those years were ending, Sarah realized. For both of them, they were building something new from the ruins of their separate griefs, something neither could have imagined, but both were beginning to hope for. When the storm finally broke 3 days later and they could open the door to a world transformed by snow, they emerged as different people than they'd been when it started. The careful distance they'd maintained had closed somewhat, replaced by a tentative but genuine intimacy that promised to grow deeper with time. Jack looked at Sarah standing in the doorway, her face lit by winter sunlight, and thought about the pressed wildflower in his journal, about how something beautiful and alive could emerge from the harshest conditions. He'd kept that flower as a reminder that survival was possible. Looking at Sarah now, he realized she'd become a reminder of something more, that not just survival, but joy, connection, and even love might still be possible for a man who'd convinced himself he was meant to be alone. Spring arrived slowly in the mountains, first as a whisper of warmer air, then as the gradual retreat of snow from the lower elevations. 2 months had passed since Sarah's wedding day, and she barely recognized herself from the desperate woman who'd reached for that loaf of bread. She'd gained weight, her cheeks now had color, and her hands had developed calluses from useful work instead of desperate wandering. More than her physical appearance had changed. She moved through the cabin and the surrounding woods with confidence now, comfortable with the rifle, capable of skinning game, knowledgeable about the edible plants starting to emerge as the weather warmed. Jack had been a thorough teacher, and she'd been an eager student. But it was more than practical skills. Sarah had begun to think of the cabin as home, to think of this wild, beautiful place as hers. She'd started sketching her own maps of the surrounding area, marking landmarks Jack had shown her, adding details she'd observed herself. Drawing helped her process the landscape, make sense of the vastness that had once seemed overwhelming. Jack had been pleased when she showed him her maps. "You've got a good eye for terrain," he'd said, studying her careful notations. "These are better than what I keep in my head. I learned from watching you," she'd replied. "The way you read the land, see patterns I never would have noticed." The compliment had made him smile, one of those rare, full smiles that transformed his usually serious face into something warmer, younger. Now, with spring making travel easier, Jack announced they needed to make a supply run to Silver Ridge. It had been 2 months since they'd been to town, and they were running low on essentials: flour, coffee, sugar, ammunition. Sarah felt a flutter of anxiety at the prospect. She'd spent these months in relative isolation, building her new life away from the judgment and curiosity of others. Returning to town meant facing people as Jack's wife, dealing with whatever assumptions or gossip had grown in their absence. "We'll leave early tomorrow," Jack said, noticing her apprehension. "Get there, do our business, and head back. Don't have to stay longer than necessary if you're not comfortable." "It's not that I'm uncomfortable exactly," Sarah tried to explain. People were kind when we married, but I know they must have questions about why you married me so suddenly. About what kind of woman gets caught stealing and ends up married the next day." Jack's expression hardened slightly. "Any questions people have are none of their business. You're my wife. That's all they need to know." The protectiveness in his voice warmed Sarah, even as it surprised her. Somewhere along the way, Jack had stopped seeing their marriage as merely a practical arrangement. He defended her now not just as a responsibility, but as someone who mattered to him personally. The next morning dawned clear and relatively warm. They set out after breakfast, riding side by side down the mountain trail. The journey that had seemed so long and intimidating to Sarah 2 months ago now felt familiar, almost comfortable. She'd learned to read the trail, anticipate the horses' movements, appreciate the stunning views without fear. They reached Silver Ridge by mid-morning. The town looked exactly as Sarah remembered it, small, worn, clinging to existence through sheer stubbornness. But now she saw it differently, through the eyes of someone who belonged somewhere else, someone who had a home to return to. Samuel saw them first. He came out of the general store wiping his hands on his apron, his weathered face breaking into a genuine smile. "Jack, Mrs. McAllister, good to see you both. Been wondering how you were getting on up there." "Getting on fine," Jack said, dismounting and helping Sarah down. His hand lingered at her waist a moment longer than necessary, a gesture that didn't escape Samuel's notice. Inside the store, they went through their supply list while Samuel filled their order. He kept up a steady stream of conversation news from town, reports of other trappers' success rates, mentions of families who'd moved on, and new arrivals who'd stayed. "Clayton Winters has been asking about you, Jack," Samuel mentioned casually. But Sarah caught the slight edge in his voice. "What's he want?" Jack's tone was careful, neutral. "Didn't say exactly, but he's been buying up land around the territory, consolidating holdings. You know how his family is always looking to expand." Jack grunted non-committally, but Sarah saw tension settle into his shoulders. They finished their business with Samuel and were loading their horses when a well-dressed man approached them. He was perhaps 30 years old, handsome in a polished way that seemed out of place in the rough frontier town, and he moved with the confidence of someone who'd never known real hardship. "McAllister," the man said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Heard you were in town. Wanted to meet your new bride. Winters." Jack's voice was flat. "Sarah, this is Clayton Winters. His family owns the big ranch south of here." Clayton removed his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "Mrs. McAllister, pleasure to make your acquaintance. Quite a story, how you and Jack came to be married." There was something in his tone, not quite insulting, but not quite respectful either, that set Sarah's teeth on edge. "My husband saved my life," Sarah said clearly. "I consider myself fortunate to have found such a good man." The emphasis on husband was deliberate, and she saw Jack's expression shift to something that might have been pride. Clayton's smile thinned. "Of course. Very romantic." He turned his attention to Jack. "Been meaning to discuss something with you, McAllister. That land of yours up in the mountains, prime timber country. My family's interested in expanding our lumber operations. I could make you a very generous offer." "Not interested," Jack said flatly. "You might want to hear the figure before you decide." "No figure's high enough. That land's mine, and it's staying mine." Clayton's expression hardened slightly. "You're squatting on unclaimed territory, McAllister. You might want to consider that before turning down opportunities. I've been on that land 15 years. It's mine by right of occupation and improvement. Territory recognizes that." "Territory law can be complicated," Clayton said smoothly. "Lots of claims from the old days don't hold up under proper scrutiny. Just something to think about." He tipped his hat to Sarah. "Mrs. McAllister, do enjoy your rustic mountain life while you can." He walked away, leaving a cold feeling in his wake. "What was that about?" Sarah asked quietly. Jack's jaw was tight. "Winter's family's been trying to buy up land around here for years. They're not used to hearing no." He started checking the straps on their packs, his movements sharp with controlled anger. "Don't worry about it. He's all bluster." But Sarah noticed how Jack's eyes followed Clayton down the street, and she didn't think it was just bluster at all. They made a brief stop at Doc Harrington's office. The doctor was genuinely pleased to see them both looking well, and after a few minutes of pleasant conversation, he asked to speak with Sarah privately. Once Jack had stepped outside, Doc said gently, "How are you really, my dear? Is Jack treating you well?" "Better than well," Sarah said honestly. "He's been kind, respectful, patient. I couldn't have asked for a better." She paused, searching for the right word. partner. Doc smiled. I'm glad to hear it. You look healthier than when you arrived, that's certain. And Jack, well, I haven't seen him this settled in years. Whatever arrangement you two have, it's clearly working. It's becoming more than an arrangement, Sarah admitted. We're becoming friends. Maybe more than friends. That's good. That's very good. Doc patted her hand. You're both good people who deserve happiness. I'm just glad you found each other, however unexpected the circumstances. The ride back to the cabin was quiet. Sarah could tell Jack was brooding about Clayton's veiled threats, but she didn't push him to talk about it. Instead, she rode beside him, close enough that their legs occasionally brushed, a silent reminder that whatever problems came, they'd face them together. That night, lying in her loft while Jack settled by the fire below, Sarah thought about Clayton's words and the uncomfortable way he'd looked at both her and Jack with a kind of calculating assessment that had nothing to do with respect. She thought about the life she was building here, how much she'd come to care about this place, and the man who'd given it to her. And she realized with sudden clarity that she would fight to protect it, not just because it was her home, but because Jack was her home. Somewhere in the past 2 months, gratitude had transformed into something deeper, something that made her heart beat faster when he smiled at her, something that made her want to reach for his hand when they sat together in the evenings. She was falling in love with her husband. The realization should have frightened her, but instead it felt right, like a truth she'd been approaching for weeks without quite recognizing it. Tomorrow she would find a way to tell him, or maybe she'd show him, in the small gestures and daily kindnesses that had become their language of affection. For now, she simply held the wooden spoon he'd carved for her and smiled into the darkness, grateful for loaves of bread and second chances and mountain men who saw value in desperate women stealing to survive. A month passed peacefully after their trip to town. The mountains bloomed into full spring, and Sarah spent her days working alongside Jack, their partnership deepening into something that felt increasingly like a real marriage in every sense. They'd grown comfortable with small touches, his hand on her shoulder as he passed behind her chair, her fingers brushing his when she handed him his coffee in the morning. Neither had spoken of the shift between them, but both felt it. Then, on a warm afternoon in late May, everything changed. Jack had ridden down to check the mail, drop a wooden box Samuel maintained at the crossroads between his property and town, where mail and official notices were left for the scattered mountain residents. He'd been gone less than an hour when Sarah heard his horse returning at a gallop instead of the usual steady pace. She hurried outside to find Jack dismounting, his face grim, a folded paper clutched in his hand. "What is it?" she asked, fear already tightening her chest. Jack handed her the document without speaking. It was an official notice from the Territorial Land Office, thick paper with an embossed seal at the top. Sarah's hands trembled as she read. Clayton Winters had filed a formal claim on Jack's land. The legal language was dense and confusing, but the essential meaning was clear. Clayton was asserting that Jack's cabin and surrounding acreage sat on unclaimed territorial land, that Jack had no filed deed or formal title, and that therefore the land was available for legal claim by any citizen who properly filed the paperwork which Clayton had done. "This can't be legal," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "You've been here 15 years. You built this cabin. You've worked this land." "Squatters' rights," Jack said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Territory recognizes them, but only if there's no competing formal claim. And if someone files proper paperwork first." He stopped, running his hand through his hair. "I never filed anything. This was my uncle's land, originally, but he died before the paperwork went through, and I just stayed. I built the cabin. I lived here. I thought that was enough." Sarah felt sick. She looked around at the cabin, the cleared land, the garden she'd helped plant just last week. This was their home, their life. "There's more," Jack said grimly. He pulled out a second sheet of paper. "Clayton's also challenging the validity of our marriage." "What?" Sarah grabbed the paper. The legal language was even more convoluted, but the argument was essentially that because their marriage hadn't been properly registered at the county seat only with Doc Harrington in Silver Ridge, it might not meet territorial requirements for legal recognition. And if the marriage wasn't valid, then Jack had harbored a vagrant woman, which apparently could be used to strengthen Clayton's claim that Jack wasn't a proper landowner. "This is insane," Sarah said, her shock turning to anger. "We were legally married. Doc Harrington is a properly appointed justice of the peace. For the town of Silver Ridge, yes. But the county seat is in Benton Falls, 2 weeks' travel from here. Apparently, there's a territorial statute that requires marriages to be recorded there within 90 days. Jack's voice was bitter. "We've got 2 weeks left before that deadline passes." Sarah's mind was racing. "So, we go to Benton Falls. We register the marriage properly. That solves at least that part of the problem." "It's not that simple. The land claim hearing is scheduled for 3 weeks from now. If we leave to go to Benton Falls, that's 2 weeks round trip through dangerous mountain passes. We'd have to leave the cabin undefended, and Clayton's made it clear he's watching for any excuse to claim we've abandoned the property." Jack sat heavily in his chair, the document crumpling in his fist. "And even if we validate the marriage and defend the property, we still have the problem that I don't have a formal deed. Clayton's lawyers could argue that my uncle's uncompleted claim doesn't transfer to me, that the land reverted to territorial ownership when he died. The full scope of the trap Clayton had set was becoming clear. They were facing multiple legal challenges, each requiring their presence in different places at different times, each with the potential to destroy everything they'd built. Sarah sat beside Jack, reaching for his hand. "Tell me about your uncle. You've never mentioned him before." Jack sighed, his thumb absently stroking her fingers. "Thomas McAllister, my father's older brother. He came out west in '62, right before the Civil War. Filed a claim on this land, started building, then the war started, and he enlisted. Died at Shiloh in '63. I was just a boy then. Didn't even know about this place until after Elizabeth and the baby. I was searching through my father's papers, looking for anything that might tell me where to go, how to disappear. Found letters from Thomas, found the rough location he'd described. When I got here, the original cabin had mostly fallen apart, but the land was empty, so I stayed." "Do you have those letters? Any of Thomas's papers?" "Somewhere. I haven't looked at them in years." Sarah stood, determination replacing despair. "We need to find them. If Thomas filed a proper claim, and your blood family, there might be legal precedent for you, inheriting his rights to the land." They spent the next several hours searching through the storeroom where Jack kept things he'd accumulated over the years. Finally, in a leather satchel buried under old furs, they found a bundle of letters tied with string and a few official-looking documents. Sarah spread them on the table, reading carefully. Most were letters between Thomas and Jack's father, full of descriptions of the West and plans for the future. But tucked among them was a document that made her heart race, a copy of Thomas McAllister's original land claim, filed with the Territorial Office in 1862, with a detailed description of the boundaries that matched exactly where they were sitting. "Jack, this is it. This proves Thomas had a legitimate claim. You're his nephew, his heir. This land should be yours by right of inheritance." Jack looked at the document, something like hope flickering in his eyes. "But we'd need to present this at the Territorial Office in Benton Falls, and we'd need witnesses who could verify the family connection." He paused. "My parents are dead. I don't know who else could testify. Do you have any proof of your relationship to Thomas? Family Bible, birth records, anything?" Jack thought for a moment, then stood and retrieved a small wooden box from the highest shelf, the same box Sarah had noticed during her first days in the cabin, the one he kept wrapped and untouched. He opened it slowly. Inside were a few precious items, a tintype photograph of a young couple, a woman's wedding ring, a folded piece of paper. Jack lifted the photograph first. "My parents," he said quietly. Then he unfolded the paper, a birth certificate. Mine. He pointed to a line near the bottom. There, born to Robert and Anne McAllister. And here he pulled out another document, my parents' marriage certificate. It lists Robert's family, father, deceased, brother, Thomas McAllister, residing in Montana Territory. Sarah felt tears of relief stinging her eyes. This is enough. This proves the connection. Combined with Thomas's original claim, this should establish your right to the land. But we still have to get this to Benton Falls and register our marriage all within 3 weeks without leaving the cabin vulnerable to Clayton's men. Jack's jaw tightened. He's planned this well. He knows the geography, knows the timeline. He's betting we can't do both. Then we do both, Sarah said firmly. We fight him on every front. We take these documents to Benton Falls, we register our marriage properly, and we prove that this land belongs to you, to us. Jack looked at her, really looked at her, and Sarah saw the war in his eyes between the fear of losing everything again and the hope that maybe, just maybe, they could win. I could lose this place, he said quietly. 15 years of my life just gone, and worse, I could lose you in the process. If this marriage gets declared invalid, if you're not losing me, Sarah interrupted fiercely. I don't care what Clayton Winters or any legal document says. I'm your wife because I choose to be, and I'll keep choosing it every day, with or without papers that say so. She gripped his hands tightly. But we're going to fight for those papers anyway, because this is our home, and no one has the right to take it from us. Jack pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her in the first real embrace they'd shared since their wedding day. Sarah pressed her face against his chest, feeling his heartbeat, strong and steady despite the fear he had to be feeling. I can't do this alone, Jack said into her hair. You're not alone. You haven't been alone since that night behind Samuel's store. Sarah pulled back just enough to look up at him. We're partners, remember? We face this together. Jack cupped her face in his large, calloused hands, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. When did this stop being about survival and start being about something else? I think it started being something else the moment you asked me when I'd last eaten, instead of dragging me to the sheriff, Sarah said softly. We just took a while to recognize it. He leaned down and kissed her then, gentle at first, then deeper as months of restrained feeling finally found expression. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard, and Jack rested his forehead against hers. I love you, he said simply. Didn't plan to, didn't expect to, but I do. I love you too, Sarah whispered back, and that's why we're going to fight for this, for us. That night, they didn't retreat to their separate sleeping spaces. Instead, they sat together by the fire, planning their strategy, two people who'd started as desperate strangers and had become something infinitely more precious partners, friends, and finally, truly, husband and wife, in every sense that mattered. The legal documents that threatened to destroy them sat on the table, but beside them sat Thomas's claim papers and the proof of family connection. They had weapons to fight with. They had each other. And they had something Clayton Winters had never counted on, the fierce determination of two people who'd already survived, losing everything and refused to let it happen again. Tomorrow they would begin the journey to Benton Falls. Tonight they held each other and promised, with or without legal validation, to stand together against whatever came next. They set out at dawn, the cabin secured as best they could manage. Doc Harrington had agreed to check on the property every few days, and Samuel had promised to keep an eye out for any of Clayton's men heading into the mountains. It wasn't perfect protection, but it was the best they could do. Jack had packed carefully the precious legal documents wrapped in oilcloth and tucked into his saddlebag, along with supplies for 2 weeks on the trail. His father's compass, a worn brass instrument that had guided his family for generations, hung around his neck. Sarah rode beside him on the gentle mare, which she'd learned to handle with confidence over the past months. The first 2 days passed without incident. They followed mountain trails Jack knew well, camping at night under the stars. Despite the stress of their mission, there was something deeply right about traveling together this way. They'd become a team over the past months, and now they moved in sync, Sarah gathering firewood while Jack tended the horses, taking turns keeping watch, sharing warmth in their bedrolls as the mountain nights grew cold. On the second night, huddled together beside the fire, Sarah asked, "What will we do if we lose? If Clayton's claim succeeds?" Jack was quiet for a long moment. "We start over. Somewhere else. Together. Just like that? Just like that." He pulled her closer. "The cabin matters to me, Sarah. Those mountains have been my home for 15 years. But you matter more. If I have to choose between the land and you, there's no choice. I choose you every time." Sarah felt warmth spread through her chest. "We won't have to choose. We're going to win." "You sound sure of that." "I am sure, because we have truth on our side, and we have each other. That has to count for something." Jack kissed the top of her head. "I hope you're right." The third day brought the first sign of trouble. Jack noticed tracks on the trail, 3 horses, moving in the same direction they were heading. Fresh tracks, no more than a few hours old. "Could be coincidence," Sarah said, but she heard the doubt in her own voice. "Could be." Jack's expression was grim. Or, "Clayton sent men to make sure we don't reach Benton Falls in time." They proceeded more cautiously after that, Jack constantly scanning the trail ahead and behind. By late afternoon, they'd reached a narrow canyon, the only practical route forward through the mountains. The steep walls rose on either side, creating perfect conditions for an ambush. "We could try going around," Jack said, studying the terrain. "But it would add 3 days to our journey. We don't have that kind of time." "Then we go through," Sarah said firmly. She checked the rifle Jack had taught her to use, making sure it was loaded and ready. Jack looked at her with something like pride. "When did you get so brave?" "I learned from you. You've spent 15 years surviving in these mountains. I trust your judgment, and I trust us to handle whatever comes." They entered the canyon, moving slowly, every sense alert. The sound of their horses' hooves echoed off the stone walls. Halfway through, Jack suddenly pulled his horse to a stop, holding up his hand for silence. 3 men emerged from behind a rock formation ahead, blocking the trail. They were rough-looking, the kind of hired guns who did dirty work for money without asking too many questions. All 3 had hands on their weapons. "That's far enough, McAllister," the largest one called out. He had a scar running down his cheek, and the cold eyes of someone who'd done violence before and wouldn't hesitate to do it again. "Mr. Winters sent us to give you a message." "I can imagine what kind of message," Jack said calmly, though Sarah could see his muscles tensing, preparing. "Let me guess. Turn back, leave the territory, forget about your land claim." "Smart man. Mr. Winters is prepared to be generous. He'll give you enough money to start fresh somewhere else. All you have to do is not show up in Benton Falls." "Not interested." The scarred man shrugged. "Didn't think you would be. But we had to offer. Now we're going to escort you back the way you came, peaceful-like, if you cooperate." "And if we don't cooperate?" Sarah spoke up, her voice steadier than she felt. The man's eyes slid to her, and something unpleasant flickered in them. "Then things get unpleasant, Mrs. McAllister, and that would be a shame." Jack's hand moved almost imperceptibly toward his rifle. Sarah recognized the tension in his body. He was calculating odds, distances, looking for options. "There's 3 of us and 2 of you," the scarred man continued. "And your wife there looks like she's got some spirit, but I doubt she's much of a shot. Best just turn around while everyone can still walk away." What happened next occurred so fast that Sarah barely registered it until it was over. A 4th man, hidden in the rocks above, stood to get a better shooting angle. Sarah, whose eyes had been scanning their surroundings as Jack had taught her, saw the movement and reacted on pure instinct. Jack! Above! Jack dove sideways as the hidden gunman fired, the shot going wide. In the same motion, Jack brought his rifle up and fired back, forcing the man to duck for cover. The three men on the trail rushed forward, and suddenly everything was chaos. Sarah aimed at the lead man and fired, her shot striking the ground near his feet and making him jump back. It wasn't a killing shot she'd aimed to warn, not to kill, but it was accurate enough to show she could use the weapon. Jack was in motion, using the canyon walls and rock formations for cover, his movements displaying the kind of tactical awareness that came from years of hunting and surviving in dangerous territory. He fired again, this time hitting one of the men in the shoulder, sending him sprawling. "Behind you!" Sarah shouted as the scarred leader tried to flank Jack. She fired again, and this time her bullet struck close enough that the man had to dive for cover. The fight lasted perhaps 3 minutes, though it felt like hours. Jack's knowledge of the terrain and his superior marksmanship gradually gave them the advantage. The man with the shoulder wound was down and screaming. The hidden shooter had retreated higher into the rocks. The other two realized they were outmatched and began backing away. "Tell Clayton this didn't work," Jack called out, his rifle still trained on them. "Tell him we're going to Benton Falls, and we're going to prove that land is mine. And tell him, if he sends anyone else after us, they'll get worse than a shoulder wound." The scarred man's expression was murderous, but he helped his wounded companion onto a horse. "This isn't over, McAllister." "No, it's not. But you're done for today. Get moving." They left, taking their wounded with them, disappearing back the way they'd come. The hidden shooter also retreated, apparently deciding the money wasn't worth facing both Jack and Sarah. Once they were alone, Jack turned to Sarah, his expression a mixture of concern and amazement. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine. Shaking, but fine." She lowered the rifle, only now realizing how hard her hands were trembling. Did I help?" Jack pulled her close, rifle and all. "You saved my life. That warning about the man above, I wouldn't have seen him in time. And your shooting kept them divided, made them think twice." He pulled back to look at her. "You were incredible." Sarah let out a shaky laugh. "I was terrified. Being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means doing what needs to be done despite the fear." Jack checked their horses, which had stayed surprisingly calm during the confrontation. "But we've got a problem now. They'll regroup and either come back with more men or try to cut us off before we reach Benton Falls. We need to move fast." The horses they'd been riding were exhausted from the fight and the day's travel. Jack made a quick decision they'd continue on foot through the night, leading the horses to let them rest. It would be brutal, but it would also be unexpected. Clayton's men would assume they'd camp and rest, giving the men time to organize. They pressed on through the canyon and beyond, using the compass and Jack's knowledge of the stars to navigate in the darkness. Sarah's legs ached, her feet hurt, but she didn't complain. She thought of the cabin, of the life they'd built, of everything they stood to lose if they failed. Near midnight, they reached a small cave Jack remembered from years ago. It was defensible, hidden from the trail, and large enough for them and the horses. They stopped to rest, both too exhausted for more than brief sleep. Sarah woke first as dawn light began filtering into the cave. Jack was sitting near the entrance, keeping watch despite his obvious exhaustion. She moved to sit beside him, and he automatically put his arm around her. "We're going to make it," she said quietly. "I know we are. How can you be sure?" "Because we have to. Because there are two kinds of people in this world, those who give up when things get hard, and those who fight harder. We're the second kind." Jack looked at her with such love and admiration that it took her breath away. "When I found you stealing that bread, I thought I was rescuing someone who needed help. I didn't realize I was the one who needed rescuing." "We rescued each other," Sarah said softly. They set out again at full dawn, pushing hard toward Benton Falls. The landscape gradually changed as they descended from the high mountains, becoming less rugged, more populated. They passed other travelers now, saw signs of settlements and farms. On the fifth day, exhausted, dusty and determined, they crested a final hill and saw Benton Falls spread out in the valley below. It was larger than Silver Ridge, a proper town with multiple streets, dozens of buildings, and even a church with a real steeple. "We made it," Sarah breathed. "First part's done," Jack said. "Now comes the hard part, proving our case." They rode into town as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the main street. The territorial office was easy to find, a solid building with an official seal above the door. But when they checked the time, they discovered it was already late afternoon. The office would close in less than an hour. "We'll go first thing tomorrow," Jack decided. "Tonight we get cleaned up, get some real rest. We'll need clear heads to deal with the bureaucracy." They found a modest hotel and took a room. Sarah washed the trail dust from her face and hair, changed into the one clean dress she'd brought. Jack did the same, transforming from a rough mountain man into someone who could navigate official proceedings. That evening, sitting in the hotel room reviewing their documents one more time, Sarah felt a strange mixture of anxiety and confidence. They'd come so far, survived an ambush, pushed through exhaustion and danger. Tomorrow they would either prove their right to their home and their marriage, or they would lose everything. But looking at Jack, seeing the determination in his eyes matching her own, Sarah knew that even if they lost the legal battle, they'd won something more important. They'd found each other. They'd built something real from the ashes of their separate griefs and desperate circumstances. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Jack said, as if reading her thoughts, "I want you to know these months with you have been the best of my life. Even with all this trouble, even with everything at stake, I wouldn't change a single moment." "Neither would I," Sarah said. "Not even the stealing." Jack laughed, the tension breaking for a moment. "Especially not the stealing. Best theft I've ever witnessed." They held each other that night, drawing strength from their partnership, from the love that had grown between them. Tomorrow they would fight for their future. Tonight they simply held on to each other, and the certainty that whatever came, they would face it together. 2 weeks passed in a state of tense anticipation. Jack and Sarah remained in Benton Falls, using the time to prepare for the hearing and to keep themselves safe from any further attempts at intimidation. They spent their days reviewing their documents, rehearsing their testimony, and consulting with Pettigrew, who'd proven surprisingly helpful beyond his official duties. The morning of the hearing arrived cold and clear. The territorial courthouse was a substantial building, the most impressive structure in Benton Falls. Sarah dressed in her best outfit, such as it was, and Jack wore clean clothes with his hair and beard neatly trimmed. They looked respectable, honest, like people who'd worked hard for what they had. Clayton Winters was already in the courtroom when they arrived, flanked by 2 lawyers in expensive suits that seemed absurdly out of place on the frontier. He smiled at them with cold confidence, clearly expecting an easy victory. The territorial judge, a stern-faced man named Horace Blackwood, entered precisely at 9 o'clock. He was in his 60s, with sharp eyes that suggested he'd heard every lie and seen every legal trick in his long career. He surveyed the courtroom, noting the parties involved, and called the proceedings to order. "We're here to adjudicate competing claims to land formerly claimed by Thomas McAllister, deceased 1863, currently occupied by Jack McAllister and subject to new claim filed by Clayton Winters." Judge Blackwood's voice was firm and clear. "Mr. Winters, as the challenging party, you'll present your case first." Clayton's lead lawyer stood a slick man named Harrison, who spoke with the practiced ease of someone who'd won many courtroom battles. He laid out their case methodically. Thomas McAllister's claim had lapsed upon his death without proper transfer. The land had reverted to territorial ownership. Jack McAllister had occupied it without filing proper claim, which constituted squatting, not legal ownership. Clayton Winters had filed all appropriate paperwork to claim the land legally. Furthermore, Your Honor, Harrison continued, we question the validity of Mr. McAllister's recent marriage, which appears to have been hastily arranged to strengthen his claim to the property. The marriage was not properly registered within territorial guidelines until just 2 weeks ago, suspiciously close to this hearing. Judge Blackwood made notes but gave no indication of his thoughts. Mr. McAllister, your response? Jack stood, and Sarah felt a surge of pride at his steady presence. He wasn't a lawyer, wasn't educated in courtroom tactics, but he had truth on his side and the quiet strength of a man defending what was rightfully his. Your Honor, Thomas McAllister was my uncle. These documents prove our family relationship. Jack laid out the birth certificates and marriage records. When he died at Shiloh, his claim didn't lapse, it passed to his family. I came to that land in 1863 with knowledge of his claim as his heir, and I've occupied it continuously for 15 years. I've built a cabin, improved the land, lived there through every season. That's not squatting, that's inheritance and stewardship. Do you have the original correspondence that led you to the land? Judge Blackwood asked. Yes, Your Honor. Jack produced Thomas's letters to his father. These letters describe the exact location and boundaries of the claim. Pettigrew stood and approached the bench. Your Honor, if I may? The Territorial Office has located the original survey records from 1862. He presented the map and surveyor's notes. Marcus Webb's survey documents Thomas McAllister's claim in detail. When you compare these boundaries to the land, Mr. McAllister has occupied, they match exactly. This isn't coincidence, it's proof of continuous family ownership. Judge Blackwood studied the survey map carefully, comparing it to the modern territorial maps. His expression was unreadable, but Sarah thought she detected a shift in his demeanor. Harrison tried to recover. Your Honor, even granting family relationship, there's no documentation of formal transfer. Because my uncle died in battle, Jack interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of old grief. He didn't have time to write a will or transfer papers. But that doesn't make his claim invalid or mean it stopped belonging to his family. I'm his blood, his heir. I found the land he claimed, I honored his memory by building on it, and I've lived there honorably for 15 years. That should count for something. Judge Blackwood leaned back in his chair. Mr. Harrison, I've seen situations like this before. Territorial law regarding inheritance and claim succession can be murky, particularly in cases involving war deaths. But there's established precedent that family members can inherit claim rights, especially when they demonstrate continuous occupation and improvement. He turned to Clayton. Mr. Winters, did you or your family have any relationship to Thomas McAllister? Any prior claim to this land before Mr. Jack McAllister's occupation? Clayton's jaw tightened. No, Your Honor. So your claim is based purely on filing paperwork for land that was already occupied by the original claimant's heir. The heir had not filed proper documentation. Because he was living on and improving the land, his uncle claimed, as family. Judge Blackwood interrupted. Mr. Winters, I've reviewed your recent land acquisitions. There's a pattern here of using legal technicalities to challenge long-standing occupations by settlers who lack formal education in territorial law. Harrison stood quickly. Your Honor, we're simply following proper legal procedures. Procedures that allow wealthy individuals to dispossess working settlers through bureaucratic manipulation, the judge said dryly. I'm familiar with the tactic, Mr. Harrison. He turned to Pettigrew. What's the Territorial Office's position on this case? Pettigrew stood. Your Honor, the surveyor's records establish that Thomas McAllister filed a legitimate claim in 1862. Jack McAllister has proven family relationship and continuous occupation since 1863. In my professional opinion, this represents valid claim succession, and we recommend formalizing Mr. Jack McAllister's ownership with a proper deed. Judge Blackwood nodded slowly. He made several notes, then looked up at both parties. I'm prepared to rule. Mr. Winters, Your claim is denied. The evidence clearly establishes that Jack McAllister is the rightful heir to Thomas McAllister's claim and has demonstrated continuous family ownership through 15 years of occupation and improvement. Furthermore, his marriage to Sarah Bennett is valid and properly registered with this territory. Sarah felt Jack's hand find hers under the table, squeezing tight. The territorial office will issue a formal deed to Jack McAllister for the land in question, with boundaries as established in the 1862 survey. Mr. Winters, you have the right to appeal this decision, but I'll tell you now that I don't see grounds for reversal. Judge Blackwood's gaze was stern. This court looks unfavorably on attempts to use legal technicalities to dispossess honest settlers. Consider that in your future land acquisition strategies. Clayton's face had gone red with fury. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly. This is outrageous. My family has rights. Your family has the same rights as everyone else, Mr. Winters. No more, no less. Judge Blackwood stood. This hearing is concluded. Jack and Sarah sat in stunned silence for a moment as the courtroom began to empty. Then Sarah threw her arms around Jack, tears of relief streaming down her face. "We won," she whispered. "We actually won." Jack held her tightly, his own eyes wet. "We did it. The land is ours, legally, officially ours." Pettigrew approached them with a broad smile. "Congratulations. The deed will be prepared within the week. You can pick it up from the territorial office, or I can mail it to Silver Ridge for you." "We'll pick it up," Jack said firmly. "I want to hold that deed in my hands, see it with my own eyes." Clayton pushed past them as he left, his lawyers trailing behind. He paused at the door, looking back with unconcealed hatred. "This isn't over, McAllister." "Yes, it is," Jack said calmly. "The judge ruled. The land is mine. Go find somewhere else to build your lumber empire." After Clayton stormed out, Sarah and Jack stood on the courthouse steps, looking out at the town of Benton Falls with new eyes. They'd come here desperate and uncertain. They were leaving as legal landowners, their marriage validated, their future secure. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked. Jack smiled, really smiled, the kind of smile she'd only seen from him a handful of times. "Now we go home." 3 months later, on a warm summer morning, Sarah stood on the porch of their cabin, watching Jack work on the expansion they'd been planning. The legal deed to their land hung framed just inside the door, a constant reminder of how far they'd come and what they'd fought to keep. The return journey from Benton Falls had been triumphant. They'd stopped in Silver Ridge to share the news, and the celebration at Samuel's store had drawn nearly everyone in town. Doc Harrington had shaken Jack's hand firmly and hugged Sarah warmly. Even the saloon owner, usually taciturn, had offered congratulations and a round of drinks on the house. Clayton Winters had left the territory shortly after the hearing. Rumors said he'd moved his operations further west, where there were more desperate settlers and fewer judges willing to stand up to wealthy families. Good riddance, Sarah thought. The cabin felt more like home than ever. Jack had started building an addition, a proper bedroom for them, freeing up the loft for the future they were both beginning to imagine. The garden Sarah had planted was thriving, providing fresh vegetables that supplemented the meat Jack hunted. They'd acquired 2 more horses and were talking about chickens for the spring. But the biggest change wasn't visible in the structure of the cabin or the expansion of their property. It was in them, in how they moved through their days together, comfortable in their partnership, secure in their love. Sarah heard Jack's hammer fall silent and looked over to see him watching her, that soft expression he got sometimes when he thought she wasn't paying attention. "What are you thinking about?" she called. "About how you looked that first night, holding that loaf of bread like it was treasure." He set down his hammer and walked toward her. "About how terrified you were. I was certain you'd throw me in jail." "I almost did." He climbed the porch steps and pulled her into his arms. "Best decision I ever made, feeding you instead." Sarah leaned into his embrace, breathing in the familiar scent of him sawdust and pine, and the soap she'd learned to make from the herbs that grew near their creek. Best decision I ever made was saying yes when you offered marriage. Even though I was a complete stranger, especially because you were a stranger who saw someone in need and chose kindness. She pulled back to look at him. That told me everything I needed to know about your character. Jack cupped her face in his hands, callous thumbs brushing her cheeks. I love you, Sarah McAllister, more than I thought I could love anyone again. I love you too. She smiled, then took a breath, gathering courage for what she needed to say. And there's something I need to tell you. She saw worry flicker in his eyes. I'm pregnant. Jack went completely still, his hands frozen on her face. For a moment Sarah worried she'd miscalculated, that the old fear would overwhelm him. Then his expression transformed, shock giving way to pure, incandescent joy. We're... He couldn't seem to form a complete sentence. We're having a baby. Doc Harrington confirmed it last week when we were in town. I wanted to be sure before I told you. Jack's eyes filled with tears, and he pulled her close, holding her with a tenderness that made her own tears fall. I thought, after Elizabeth and our son, I thought I'd never have this chance again. Are you happy? Sarah asked, even though she could feel his happiness in how he held her. Happy doesn't begin to cover it. He pulled back, looking at her stomach with wonder. A baby. Our baby. Then worry crossed his face. Doc says you're healthy? Everything's all right? Everything's perfect. He says I'm strong and the baby's growing well. He'll check on me regularly, and when the time comes... She placed her hand over his heart. This time will be different, Jack. I'm young, I'm healthy, and we have Doc Harrington. This time will be different. Jack nodded, swallowing hard. I know it will be. It's just, I know. She understood the fear behind his joy, the ghost of old trauma that would never completely disappear. But we'll face it together, just like we faced Clayton Winters and that long journey and everything else. Together, Jack agreed, placing his large hand gently over her still flat stomach. The three of us. That evening they sat on the porch together, watching the sun set over the mountains that had become their home. Jack had his arm around Sarah, his hand resting protectively on her middle, and she leaned into him, feeling more content than she'd ever imagined possible. What do you think your parents would say? Jack asked softly. About all this? About us? Sarah considered the question. I think my mother would say that sometimes the path to happiness takes us places we never expected. And my father would say that any man who treats his daughter with respect and kindness is welcome in the family. She smiled. What about your Elizabeth? Do you think she'd be happy for you? Jack was quiet for a long moment. I think she'd be grateful that I found someone who brought me back to life. She always said I had too much love to give to waste it on being alone. He kissed Sarah's hair. I think she'd like you. I think she'd be glad I found you. I wish I could have known her. She was wonderful. But so are you, in your own way. Different, but just as wonderful. Jack tightened his arm around her. I'll never forget her or our son, but I'm ready to build new memories now, good ones, with you and our child. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell and stars began to appear in the vast sky above. Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her here, the loss of her parents, the betrayal that left her stranded, the desperate night she'd reached for bread just to survive. If someone had told her then that within 6 months she'd be sitting here, loved and safe and pregnant with a child, she wouldn't have believed them. But life had a way of surprising you. Sometimes the worst moments led to the best outcomes. Sometimes what seemed like an ending was actually a beginning. Jack, she said softly. Thank you for not turning me in that night. Thank you for seeing someone worth saving instead of just a thief. Jack pulled her closer. Thank you for saying yes. Thank you for taking a chance on a lonely mountain man who didn't know how much he needed saving too. You stole more than bread that night, Sarah said, echoing his words from earlier. What did I steal? She smiled into the darkness. My heart, though I think I gave it willingly. Jack laughed softly. Then we're both thieves. Because you stole mine the moment I saw you standing there, terrified but defiant, refusing to give up even when everything seemed lost. Above them, the stars wheeled in their eternal dance. Around them, the mountains stood solid and unchanging. And inside the cabin behind them, a new wooden sign waited to be hung, the McAllister home, carved by Jack during the long evenings, a symbol of permanence and belonging. From a stolen loaf of bread had grown a lifetime of love, proving that sometimes what we think we're taking is actually what saves us. Two desperate souls had found each other in the darkness, and together they'd built something neither could have created alone, a home, a partnership, a family, a future. And as they sat together under the vast Montana sky, Sarah and Jack McAllister knew with absolute certainty that they were exactly where they were meant to be, with exactly the person they were meant to love. The journey had been hard, the obstacles nearly insurmountable, but they'd faced everything together, and they would face whatever came next the same way, hand in hand, heart to heart, building their life one day at a time in the mountains they'd fought so hard to keep.